Well, good afternoon or good morning to those who are in different time zones. And we're gonna start the schedule that is on the website. So now we're just gonna present ourselves real quick. So my name is Elizaveta Burina and I'm currently at the University of Paris 1.
And my name is Spencer Banzhaf. I'm at Georgia State University.
Hi, my name is Ecem Okan and I'm currently at Arizona State University.
Okay, so I guess we're gonna start with my presentation, and please ask your questions in the Q&A section, and we're gonna do presentation and right after answer all your questions. So we're gonna see the queue of questions. Okay, I'm gonna start sharing my screen with the presentation. All right, so I'm going to talk about Vladimir Bazarov's restoration process model and how it is an example of the use of analogies in economics. So here is the quick outline. I'm gonna introduce you to who Bazarov is and what analogies are. Then we're gonna talk about models themselves and I'll give some concluding remarks. So I should stay within 20 minutes or maybe even 15. So the topic of analogies in science is nothing new. So there are analogies used by natural scientists as shown in a classical work of HES. There are analogies, HES and Marcel Boumans. So there are analogies used by social scientists in general. So the works of Bernard Cohen and Neil DeMarchi are more historical. Then there are specific works focused on how analogies are used by economists. So analogies from different sciences, from natural sciences, from biology, from chemistry or physics. So there is a work of Philippe Mirovsky, which is pretty much an attack on the use of analogies. And there are methodological articles and the book of edited by Mary Morgan and Margaret Morrison, Models as Mediators. So this topic is very well studied, which gives us instruments to analyze new cases. So today I'd like to present you, let's say, case study, an example of the use of analogies with chemistry by an economist, Vladimir Bazarov, who worked actually both in Tsarist Russia and Soviet Union, but I'm gonna more focus today on his work already during the Soviet Union period. So he was working on the elaboration of the first social plans. Let's see a quick presentation of intellectual biography of Bazarov. I'm saying that he's chemist, philosopher, and economist. I can add that he was also a physicist, so that was thanks to his education. So first of all, I should state the birth date. It is 1874 he was born, so he actually had a chance to work before the revolution and after the revolution. So in 1892, he entered Moscow State University, Faculty of Physics and Mathematics, and he was majoring in chemistry. And then he already in the university engaged in revolutionary activities, so that's how he got expelled. And he was exiled to Tula, his native city. So these years here, 1892, 1895, these are 3 years that he spent in Moscow, but he didn't finish his education. He didn't pass the exams because due to exile. But then after he could come back to the capitals again, he went to study philosophy in Berlin University. So here we see already a broad background of this person. about his philosophical views that established after his studies. He was a Marxist. At least he was saying that he was a Marxist. And he had some disagreements with Marx on labor theory, for example. However, in general, he was, and in all his works, he was emphasizing the fact that he was Marxist. His philosophy was Marxist. But moreover, he was a member of the so-called Russian Machists group. So we should read it with Machists. It's the followers of Ernst Mach. So they took from Mach and from a little bit from Avenarius as well. So we can say that they were empiriocriticists. So the main thing that encouraged these economists, not only economists, actually the majority, they were trained as scientists, chemists, physicists, biologists, and what they found in Mach was the primordial role of experience for knowledge, the rejection of metaphysics, the idea of unified science, and also, which is very important and will be very important for my presentation, the substitution of the notion of causal relation by the notion of mathematical functions. So Ernst Mach, in his analysis of sensation, devoted a big chapter to the discussion what is best, using causal, like A causes B, or using mathematical functions. So his conclusion was that it is the mathematical functions that have to be used, and Bazarov used this, he felt this idea and he used it a lot. So actually the group, this Russian Machists, they reminded me a little bit of Vienna Circle. So, well, right now I'm working on the other paper with working title, Was There Vienna Circle in Soviet Russia? Well, that, since Bazarov was a part of a group, that influenced a lot his views and his methodology, which is very important. Well, about his work, so he was doing many things. He was working as a translator, he was working as a writer, he was writing philosophical articles. I'm not so sure he ever worked as a chemist. So he started, after his chemistry education, paying way more attention to philosophy, and eventually he ended up in Gosplan. It is a state agency for social planning back in the USSR, and the years when he worked in Gosplan are 1921, 1930. These years were very important for the establishment of Soviet economy, because from 1921 to 1928, let's say, the economic policy that was conducted was called New Economic Policy. Main things, it was favoring the development and creation of small business. And at the same time, within this period, the ideological control was relatively mild. So this is very interesting period in Soviet history, and very interesting period in Bazarov's life, because that period was when he actually could apply his ideas, also his philosophical ideas, to real task, the first social plans. So the first social plan was the 5 years one, was from 1928 to 1932. But before that, the Gosplan was published in so-called control numbers. Those were 1-year plans. Okay, so this is a very quick, I don't think I should now spend a lot of time on that. Just to introduce you with the methodology, I prefer using Cohen's methodology, so calling what Bazarov used as homology. So you can read the Cohen's definition, that homology for similarity that depends primarily on structure. And what Bazarov was saying in his little methodological note is that we can apply the same method. So we can use the methods of chemistry in economics, in other social sciences, if the processes have the same structure. So this is pretty much fitting the definition of homology by Cohen. So Bazarov's approach in general, because the elaboration of these models that I'll present, they are conditioned by many things. So first thing is that Bazarov's idea of social planning methodology was a synthesis of genetic and teleological. So genetic is when we use extrapolation of existing trends in our economy in order to predict the dynamics and use that to our social planning. Teleological is more, it's an approach where we set a goal and we go for it. So Bazarov suggested that teleological also is very important, otherwise how do we set our goals? But it should be used for only state manufacturers, for big heavy machinery industries owned by the state. But he was also very much in favor of the development of small business, so agriculture, retail, and pretty much all small business, according to him, should be planned genetically. So we should study the market trends and based on market trends, build our plans. So his modeling methodology, I guess since he was not trained as an economist and there was no training as an economist back then as we imagine it and have it now, he used a lot his training in chemistry. So what we're focusing on today is the process of the Soviet economy recovery after the wars, after the Civil War, after the First World War, as a chemical reaction. So his mathematical solution, therefore, very simple. It was using the same differential equations as in chemistry. And as a result, he came up with two simple models, simple as in simplified, and he published his findings in 1927. Each model was built upon a homology or analogy. Well, I prefer homology. So let's see our first model. Okay, so I made this table to show you how Bazarov proved that he could use chemical process to model economic process. So before you read, I'm just gonna give you a couple of assumptions. So first of all, we consider a market with already established demand, but with no supply. So we're in the situation of underproduction. There are a lot of customers who want the good, but there is no good. And then all of a sudden, the supply increases and increases up to the point to pretty much market saturation. So there is an abrupt increase in supply, and the supply is enough to satisfy all the customers, all the consumers. So what happens? Bazarov compared this process with the process of mixing sodium bicarbonate and the sodium chloride. So he was saying that we have, on the one hand, a very well-known process for the solution and how solution behaves. Molecule of sodium meets a molecule, sodium bicarbonate meets a molecule of the sodium chloride. Okay, it corresponds to the situation when a consumer who needs a good actually finds it in the market. So time 0, there is nothing. Time 1, there is a lot of supply, and consumers start buying it. So what interested Bazarov is the pace. So how would it go? Like this, like this, like that. So he decided to build it upon chemical reaction. So for the equation, we need A, which is total number of consumers, And X is the number of consumers who actually got the product. So he was modeling X, right? Because X is, well, also the number of realization sales. And then this should be like that because he was considering at each point, so how does the number of consumers who didn't get the product yet evolves, and we see here the differential equation part. So we are modeling the speed of sales, let's say like that. What is P? P is a probability of a customer, of a consumer to meet the good. So at each point T, P is an average probability. So he used also some Maxwell's theory to back up the idea that the average probability will stay the same. And then came up with this differential equation. It's a very standard one. So it's the Newton's cooling law, the very first differential equation that the students study at the university. And he used it, and he used it well. I'll show you the data now. So let's finish with that. Chemical process goes on. Carbon dioxide obtained after the reaction of the two substances goes away to the atmosphere. This is very important because in case the product of chemical reaction stays within the solution, it does not correspond to the economic process. Why? Because when the consumer and the good meet, they both disappear from the market. So he had to choose a precise reaction. So sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride. And the reaction continues until all molecules react, the same way as the sale of a good continues until the saturation of demand. And let's see the data. So this data is not prepared by Bazarov. He used data prepared by a PhD student who was working in Kharkiv in a Ukraine city. So this is the number of new books sold. So each column, right, is a certain book. First is about malaria, the second is about work contract, and well, we don't care much which books there were. The idea is that there were no books, and bam, there were books. So this situation, very short term, corresponds very well to Bazarov's equation, because the dark one, not dashed, is empirical curve, and the dashed curve is theoretical curve, which corresponds to equation. And this is pretty great. So he proved his point that this can be used. However, you already understand that this is a very particular case, and it works only for the short term. And he used linear differential equation. The solution can be only, well, exponential. So it goes like that, or it goes down, well, concave, convex, that's all we can have. So it's a monotone function in the very end. So he suggested the second model, which was more realistic according to him. What changes here? What changes here is that there is no supply that comes as a wave. Supply increases gradually. So that's how we can start with the part of the market to understand. Sales will increase in proportion to the quantity that has already been sold. Well, the supply gradually goes, supply gradually appears. So in the beginning, we can understand that, well, the customers buy it quite fast, just appearing good and in limited quantity. However, when the demand gradually tends to saturation, the process slows down and asymptotically converges to a new level. So here with the letters is a bit different. What is X? It's the same thing. The number of consumers who managed to get the good. A is a new level of the market that resulted from the increased labor productivity level. So, well, the supply appears not from nowhere. So the supply appears due to the change in technology or in labor productivity. So we say that A, the new level to which the process will asymptotically converge. It's a new level of labor productivity, which causes increase in supply, well, increase in demand. Not straightforward, but that was Bazarov's logic behind it. So A is important here because it's a new level. So he then used this model to explain business cycles. But for now, we focus just on the equation and on the analogy. And here, this point x is equal to a divided by 2. In the simplified case that Bazarov presented, it meant that exactly in the middle here, so when we pass from all the labor productivity level to a new one, in the middle, there is the change of pace. So it's not increasing anymore, it starts decreasing. So I have to state here that this equation is a nonlinear differential equation. So that was something new. And well, at the same time, something new was actually analyzing the dynamics more than equilibrium, right? Because we could, he could come up with the equilibrium theory for that kind of economy. But well, I've been reading on the use of nonlinear equations, and the literature, well, there is some sort of consensus that in turbulent times, economists, social scientists tend to analyze the dynamics more than equilibrium. So they give up their equilibrium theories and they start analyzing the dynamics. So there was also data supporting this S-shaped logistic curve. And this is data from the Soviet Union. We have, I think you don't see much. Well, I can show you, doesn't matter again. So this is freight traffic, hard coal output, yarn manufacture, and crude steel production. What matters is that he showed, it was the data that he used from Gosplan. He showed that this is weighted average year. So it's to get all the point in the middle of the more fluctuating line, we take an average of 12 months. So when he did this smoothing, he showed that the S shape is there. Well, it is different, and certainly the data is so complicated, and there were problems with trust statistics or not, problems with how the data was gathered. But anyways, we can see that somehow the data proved Bazarov's point. And my concluding remarks, first of all, we should think of the determinants of Bazarov's approach, because it was not a mere coincidence that he decided to come up with exactly this kind of model. So first of all, I am emphasizing the new economic policy regime, which meant, first of all, more or less free market, well, for certain kind of industries. And second of all, more or less free speech. So you would not be exiled for using one or other kind of economic methodology, mathematic methodology, because, well, after that, what happened is after the new economic policy, the Soviet Union entered in the phase of forced collectivization, industrialization, and Stalin's regime was way more, well, we know how it was. And so for Bazarov, the same thing happened. He was, well, in the end of his work in Gosplan, he was prosecuted as a Menshevik, which, well, there was a fabricated case against a group of economists whose methodology was not very well accepted. And Bazarov, which is very interesting, was actually criticized for this, for the asymptotically converging to a new level. So what Stalin suggested is that the, well, Soviet economy, let's say, is said to grow exponentially. Well, forever, I guess. That's what he said. He had an article, a speech that's called Great Turn. And in that speech, he actually explicitly stated that the economists like Bazarov didn't understand anything. What kind of thing is this slowing pace? We're gonna do exponential. And that was picked up and used in economic literature as well as a contradiction. So on the one hand, we have Bazarov, who is talking about slowing pace, and on the other hand, we have Stalin, who is for the exponential growth. And not everyone even understood what exponential growth is. However, that was used, and that was one of the things why he could not continue his work. Well, he didn't die in exile or in jail. He died of pneumonia at home.
Elizaveta, I know it's hard to talk and watch the time. You're at about 25 minutes, I think.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's true, because I'm full screen. Thank you very much.
Sure,
well,
sure.
I'm done here. And just the last remark that for Bazarov, it was a tool of scientific discovery, and he was borrowing the tool from the most legitimate science. And as I see it, his most important contribution was, first of all, increased level of formalization, and second, introduction of nonlinear differential equations into economic model. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm gonna go check the questions and answers. Okay.
I can't do Q&A, so after Marcel has a bunch. After him, I'd like to ask one.
Okay, okay. Do mathematical functions refer to some ontology like a causal account would do? Well, I believe so. I mean, I'm open to the discussion, but I think that it's the same. We should find an answer in math that he was saying that there is no such a thing as one causing another. Everything is moving. Everything is a constant flow of, well, in math it was constant flow of sensations. In Russian math this was a little bit different, but applying to economic methodology, it was the flow. And I believe that it reflected in using more math for, well, that particular group. My preference is to use the term homology. Well, it is just because of how Cohen determined homology. Analogy would be similarity that depends primarily on relations of functions, as in not functions like mathematical functions, but like fork is the same as spoon because we use them for the same purpose. That's how I view it, and that's why I chose homology, which if we just look up in a dictionary, it will be, I could very well use the term analogy too. Is there a connection at Lotko relationship? Okay, I have no idea, honestly. Well, I'll look into that because so far I haven't seen it. Well, I haven't seen it in the secondary literature, and I myself did not investigate that. But thank you very much. I'm gonna, well, write that thing down. Thank you. Okay.
I had a question as well. The panelists can't use the Q&A. I was wondering if there was a connection between the chemistry and his Marxism. So sort of in popular language, we use the word chemistry, at least in English, to sort of, describe anything that's a synthesis, sort of a nonlinear outcome from the inputs. So whether it's romantic chemistry or any other kind of chemistry, right? You put some things together and you get something different out, which at a very rough level is not unlike Hegelian synthesis. I was wondering if there was any connection there.
I see. Well, I'd say, well, in Russian, we also use the word chemistry in that sense sometimes. but I think it's more just about his education, and he had the toolbox of chemistry, so he knew. And then, due to his understanding of economic processes, I'm not so sure if actually we cannot say right now that his understanding of what was happening in the Soviet Union was actually the same as the function, well, the reaction. But there is also a deeper idea of the science within the group of Russian Marxists. They were saying that Marxist ideology, philosophy, economics is very scientific, and what we should encourage ourselves to use is scientific language. And well, back then, at least within the group, scientific was believed physics, chemistry, biology a little bit. So what they were mainly using, all of them, was physics, chemistry, and they were, as well as Vienna Circle, searching for this unified language of objectivity. And for them, it was mathematical functions, whatever they learned in university as part of physics and chemistry. Okay. Any more questions? No? Well, that's great, because I can pass the board to Ecem and she'll have her time. Thank you. Yeah, I have a thank you slide.
Is Ecem going next, or am I going next?
Well, she's supposed to go next.
Okay, all right.
But I don't see her camera, I don't see her mic.
Well, in the program, I am the last one.
Are you?
I was waiting for Spencer to go next, because that's how it's marked in the program.
I'll go.
But I mean,
yeah, that's what I thought too. I'll go ahead and go. I got confused for a moment. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
All right. All right, have I shared? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, so the short title of this piece is Pollution Pricing Without Pigou. The longer title that's in the paper, I'll have to read it myself, is A History of Pollution Pricing, or Why Everything You Thought You Knew About It Is Wrong, and Pigouvian Taxes Aren't Necessarily Pigouvian, which is my fun way to play with it. It seems obvious that there would be a connection between environmental economics, a theory of externalities, and internalizing those externalities through what we call today a Pigouvian tax, pricing the pollution so that the costs of pollution are internalized. And indeed, most standard histories of environmental economics would trace the work that began in the late 50s and in earnest in the 1960s, where they start talking about those kinds of issues, would trace those back to Pigou. However, there are three problems with that kind of narrative. And these problems have been brought out in a lot of recent literature, secondary literature in the history of economics. I have some references there. Steve Medema's recent paper in Hope, Natalie Burtis' recent work are two good examples, have pointed out a few problems with this narrative. So one of the problems with what I'll call the standard textbook narrative is that Pigou's discussion of issues where there's a divergence between social benefits or costs and private benefits and costs is a lot more complicated than today's discussion of externalities. That literature developed over time, and you know, the idea of externalities really kind of solidified, let's say, in the late 1950s. And Pigou's discussion, he actually had three categories of situations where there might be a divergence between private and social benefits and costs. The second of those, I've got them here on my screen, I'm going to go out of order a little bit. The second of those is what looks a lot more like what we would call externalities today, and he gives the example of smoke from factory chimneys, and he develops this through a lot of examples that are very sort of proto-environmental. So that's what makes this the standard narrative awfully tempting. But there are two other classes he talks about. The first I have listed here is situations where someone is making an investment in an asset, but they don't actually own the asset. And Pigou's prominent example there is land tenure. So someone who's farming the land but doesn't own the land. They might have an incentive to let the soil quality depreciate or not fully invest in it with manuring and so forth. And then the third example is basically sort of Marshallian economies of scale and scope. So an investment in one industry by one firm in the industry that, through learning by doing or some other kinds of effects helps other firms. And that one, of the three, that was probably the most controversial and developed the most. Interestingly, for my story, it developed through a transatlantic debate. This is sort of problematic for the standard history. All this is problematic for two reasons. First of all, it means it wasn't obvious that Pigou's overall discussion was smack on related to environmental economics when environmental economics emerged in the 60s. There was a lot there in Pigou, and how it applied wasn't necessarily obvious. The second issue that it's important, reason why it's important, is that it shows Pigou's discussion isn't so unique to Pigou. Number two there, the thing that sort of became externalities, that's probably the most unique to Pigou. The other issues, as I mentioned, economies of scale and scope by the 1960s, that had developed by a lot of other economists, Alan Young, Frank Knight, Alison Fellner. The first, property rights and incentives, that's kind of really a lot of common sense stuff. And a lot of economists have talked about those issues. You could find it in Aristotle if you wanted. So again, it's not necessarily clearly Pigouvian. Okay, so that's the first problem. Second problem that the literature has brought out is that if you just follow the literature in between, say, 1930 and 1960, there's a big gap there. So you can't say that there was a continuous evolution from Pigou to the 1960s environmental economics literature. You'd have to say that there was a gap, and that when environmental economics emerged in the 1960s, they went back 30 years to a Pigou that was just there waiting for them and took him off the shelf. That would have to be your story. And then the third problem is that actually, even in the 60s, if you look at the literature, Pigou isn't mentioned that much. That's been pointed out, but I developed it a little bit more in my paper. Here's a graph of annual hits from JSTOR of things related to Pigouvian tax or Pigovian or fees or charges, all sorts of variations of something like Pigouvian tax. And I'll just let you kind of look at that graph for a second. As you can see, it's really more like 1970 that it takes off. There are a few references in the 60s, but not many. Buchanan is one, and then it's really Baumol and Oates who start talking about it, and it gets into the mainstream environmental literature in the 70s. My theory is that it's the name Pigouvian that was attached to an idea of pollution pricing. That name was attached around 1970. In the 1960s, as the ideas of pollution pricing were developed, it wasn't necessarily Pigouvian. There were other sources relating to the issues that the American economists, at least, could draw on. And that was more related to the history of agricultural and natural resource economics in America that had been wrestling with similar issues for a long time. I'll come back to that. So let's talk a little bit now about what did happen in the 1960s. And I'm going to talk about my main character is Alan Caneza, who wrote about what we would today call it Pigouvian taxes. He called it effluent charges. So effluent being the emissions of pollution coming out. He was mostly looking at water, So he's thinking about gunk coming out of a pipe and being deposited into a water basin. The Economics of Regional Water Quality Management, 1964, is his seminal work. He did a lot between 1960 and 1972 or so. And he was widely recognized in the literature as the guy for pollution pricing. So everyone, he got hundreds of citations from the most applied people, really in the weeds, in the trenches, if you will, to Nobel Prize winners who were all going to Kneze. He was the go-to guy on this. And he basically was saying that, look, right now we have all these regulations. They're really burdensome administratively, and also they don't equate marginal costs of reducing pollution across technologies, which is what you would want for an efficient approach to pollution. And he said, furthermore, ideally, we would equate marginal benefits of abating pollution to marginal costs, right? And reduce pollution up to the point where X marks the spot. That's what we would really want to do. And so we'd want to set a fee at that level that looks like a Pigouvian fee, doesn't it? But he doesn't say that. But he talks in those terms. But then he says, but look, maybe one day we'll be able to do it. Right now, we can't measure the damages of pollution very well. There's some promising work going on there, but it's not developed enough. So what we can do is just decide on a level of environmental quality we want. We'll call that an ambient quality standard. So ambient, what's out there, the quality of the environment that's out there. We want to achieve some level of that. And we need to reduce pollution emissions, effluent, to get there. And so we'll put a fee on the effluent that's sufficient to produce the quality improvement that we're looking for, the target we're looking for. And we'll have to experiment with the charge to get there. So we'll take, this is kind of, it's kind of a groping, if you will, a tete-a-molle process where we'll take a guess at the charge, see how much improvement we get in environmental quality, and adjust the effluent charge until we're there. That's his proposal in a nutshell. Getting out of the specifics of his work, let me just highlight a few features of his overall approach. First of all, as I've already mentioned, in general in the 60s, there were no citations or even mentioning of Pigou's name. And this is true about Kneze's work, which is supposedly the quintessential work on Pigouvian pricing in the 1960s. It doesn't mention the name Pigou at all in the book or his follow-up book. In fact, he actually talks more about Coase. If he talks about Coase at all, it's more. He talks about Coase. It's more Coase 1937, the theory of the firm. He introduces as a model, he doesn't say it's realistic, but as a model, he introduces what he calls the basin-wide firm, where we could imagine one firm owning all the economic activities that contribute to water pollution or depend on water quality in some way. And imagine that firm owning everything, then it would internalize all the effects. So the upstream paper mill, say, would think about how costly it would be to reduce pollution, but also its own effects on its own firm, the firm owned or the activities owned downstream, where they charge for recreation to go swimming downstream. So there's this imaginary firm that owns can sell tickets to recreation activity, and this firm owns it all and internalizes it all. That's his model. He doesn't say it's realistic, but that's his model for thinking rather than perfect competition. What we learn from that is the importance of spatial aggregation. So the optimal boundary of the firm in a Coase 37 nature of the firm kind of sense, the optimal boundary is the whole water basin. You don't really need to go across water basins because you don't get effects across water basins. Next, you see his kind of analysis in terms of comparative institutions. So, he talks about Coasean bargaining. He does talk about coast problem social cost is one kind of approach. He talks about this basin-wide firm. It's ridiculous. It would have monopoly power and administrative costs. But then he uses that model of the basin-wide firm to say, what we want here is a regulatory agency that has a jurisdiction that's the basin and would think the way a basin-wide firm would think. So that becomes the normative, that becomes the norm. What I would suggest is that when we see someone talk, not talk about Pigou at all when talking about pollution pricing, talking about coasts a little, but then pivoting to very un-Coastian policy remedies within the discussion of coasts, there's a lot more going on here than Pigou or even a Pigou-Coast distinction. So sort of a Cambridge LSE debate is not the way to think about American economics in 1964. A couple more features. He talks a lot about industry-wide or inter-industry economies, actually even more than diseconomies, even when he's talking about pollution. So effects from one industry to the other. So the paper mill on the recreation industry, that would be a diseconomy. But he also talks about economies in terms of joint products, of sharing, water storage across industries and so forth upstream. I got to watch the time here. I'm not going to be able to develop that as much as I like, but let's just say that, just let me leave it that there's a lot of that sort of that third category of Pigou of what we might call economies of scale in the discussion. And then later, there's more of the common property stuff. Canesa later explains it to popular audiences in those terms. The second half of the 1960s pollution literature is on tradable pollution rights. Thomas Crocker wrote an important article in 1966. John Dales, 2 years later, wrote a book, 1968. Crocker was first, but Dales had much more immediate impact. So say circa 1970, he seems to have been noticed and cited much more. Crocker went on to have a much more prominent career in environmental and natural resource economics. So his work kind of got rediscovered later, I think. Basically, in a nutshell, they were looking more at what today we would call the tradable permit or cap and trade side of the story. And how do they develop their argument? They start out by saying, well, like coasts, we want to start with the fact that there's reciprocal harm between polluters and those who would like to enjoy the environmental quality, right? There's opportunity costs there. That's the starting point. Like Canesa, they agree that we can't set pollution prices equal to marginal damages. So therefore, we should just set standards for environmental quality. But then they criticize Canesa and say, well, look, Canesa, you have to do all this trial and error to find the right price. Rather than guess at the right price, let's just define a quantity of pollution we want and create rights to that much pollution, distribute them and let them trade, and then let the market set the price. And we'll be there, no guesswork. That's actually clearer in Dales's work because Dales was not trying to achieve a level of environmental quality. Dales just wanted to achieve a reduction in emissions. And so you could just target the quantity of emissions very straightforwardly. Crocker's version was much more complicated. He wanted to get the level of environmental quality. So he still had to know how many emissions to allow to get that environmental quality. So a complication there. Last thing to mention is that they both talk a lot about common property issues. They basically say, look, the problem is we're treating the environment, whether it's the atmosphere or the air, as a free good, as common property. But maybe a long time ago, that was a reasonable thing to do. It was basically a free good. Now it's not. Now we really have scarcity with these resources, and so therefore we have to price them. And so they talk about Gordon's 1954 work on the commons, his work on fisheries. If you're not familiar with it, was a key paper at JPE that year on common property resources. Crocker also talked about air versus airspace. He made this distinction between airspace, which is just the volume, what you can do in a volume, and the air, the particles of oxygen and pollutants that pass through that space. And in doing that, he's making a direct analogy to Richard Ely and other agricultural economists and resource economists who talked about land versus standing space. I don't have time to get into it, but Ely basically developed all his work on land economics by starting with that analogy. There's land versus standing space, and then we can think about different ways of organizing property rights around standing space versus the ability to extract resources from the land. And Ely didn't talk about air that much like Crocker did, but he talked about groundwater a lot. And he talked about how, well, if you just own a vertical space on your plot of land, then you can access groundwater that's moving across it, and you can stick your straw in the ground and suck up all that groundwater and take the water away from your neighbors because the water moves across underground. It's fluid underground. And that's a big problem in the American West, where water is so scarce. And Crocker was working on those issues with his advisor and talking about Ely's work on that at the very beginning of his graduate career. So basically my argument is that historically pollution pricing was not Pigouian. I've said that enough. And if we were to find it in Pigou, it would be his other two categories, not that middle one that looks most like externalities, but the other two. We'd find it in Pigou's discussion of economies of scale. Canesa and almost all the first generation environmental economists had trained and done their earliest work in the 1950s on benefit cost analysis of the development of resources, not preserving them, but developing, using them. And there's a long tradition in American natural resource economics of that, moving west, developing resources, well, writ large, you get in the popular imagination the idea that as we do that, that's how American civilization develops. It's economies of scale on the big picture. A cinematic American West development of resources and economies of scale from that. But in the small, it's developing water projects, and that's what those environmental economists had done early in their career. And then secondly, it would be Pigou's other category, common property by analogy to a tenant farmer who doesn't own his or her own land. I've mentioned Ely here. Henry Taylor, Ely's student, is probably the father of American agricultural economics. Interesting. Pigou is mostly citing Taylor's work when he talks about it. And then you get a lot of traditions, as the economists turn to natural resource economics, a lot of traditions of using the farmer and the tenant farmer as an analogy for understanding common property in natural resources at the national level. So unowned forests for the nation are like the tenant farmer. Just as we want the farmer to own his own land, Roosevelt said in a famous speech, we need to invest and take ownership and stewardship of our natural resources like water and forests. So my point is that when we look at those other categories that Pigou talked about, there were actually a lot of traditions that American economists could draw on, and it wasn't just Pigou. Of course, Pigou was relevant, but he wasn't the only source. And with that, I will just thank you and take any questions you may have. Okay, so I'm just going to read here from Mark Silverman. A common narrative in environmental economics is to set up the Coasean perspective as a rebuttal to the Pigouian perspective. Absolutely. The idea being that Pigou did not understand, yes, Pigou did not understand the reciprocal nature of the externalities. Can you say more about the implications for this narrative of the fact that Coase seems to have been discussed by Canesa and others before Pigou? Thank you. Yes, I agree with that. If you just looked at the citations and the name dropping, you'd have to say Canesa was more Coasean than Pigouian. In a weak moment, I'm tempted to, after a beer, I might take that approach. Actually, I don't really think that is true. I think it's more likely to, it's better to say that those two boxes, and I don't just want to blur boxes, but those two boxes are real boxes, but those aren't the only boxes. And that when an economist in 1960 who's in his 40s and had been trained reading Ely and his agricultural economics work and new American, old institutional economics, there would be connections between the Coasean approach and that approach. And so you could be not necessarily Coasean, but still be interested in Coase's work and use language that was very Coasean, just because you're doing comparative institutional analysis. So that's how I would go with that one. Jimena, thank you. I have two questions. One, why do you think Pigou's name was attached? Two, are the authors in this American tradition familiar with Pigou's work? Let me take the second one first. They are absolutely familiar with Pigou's work. There's no, it's not like, I mean, I don't want to say that, who's this Pigou guy? No one ever heard of him. No, of course, Pigou is a very prominent economist and prominent welfare economists. They were familiar with his work. Interestingly, Canesa and his colleague at Resources for the Future, John Crutilla, they both talk about Pigou, but when they're talking about Pigou earlier in their work, they're talking about Pigou very generally for his welfare economics. And the basic idea that on my reading is not unique to Pigou, but they're attributing it to Pigou. The basic idea that, well, in competitive equilibrium, the price is equal to marginal willingness to pay. And so therefore, to a first order approximation, we can use what Pigou called the national dividend as kind of a measure of material well-being. That's Pigou to them. And then they say, well, the problem, and then they critique it. And they say, well, the problem with this is that Pigou is too casual and all that about interpersonal comparability of utility. And Pigou's work has really now been superseded by the new welfare economics of Hicks and others. So Canesa says that in a 1960 article. And then that's basically the last time he mentions Pigou's name for 10 years. Until it comes back in 1970. And Crutilla, similar, others similar. Crutilla at the end of his career writes this retrospective essay where he basically says, my whole work is thinking about that issue. But it's not narrowing in on Pigou as Pigouvian pricing. It's not externalities. When they talk about externalities, external economies, they're still talking about it. They're more likely to refer to Alan Young or Ellis and Fellner and Knight, who of course had all been reacting to Pigou. But by that point, it seemed like they felt that idea had been better developed by others. Why do you think Pigou's name, why do I think Pigou's name was attached? I don't know for sure. Steve Medimas has suggested that actually, ironically, it was Coase, who brought it in. And so Coase chose to use that as his point of criticism. We all understand that when one writes an article, one simplifies one's opponent in order to attack it. And one minimizes the connections between one's own work and other people's work. So I think there might be some of that going on, that just as Pigou was not totally unique, Coase was not totally unique either. Other people were doing institutional comparisons and thinking about the size and boundaries of firms and so on. But the name could have come in then. And as I'm tracing it, then it's Buchanan. So it's sort of the anti-Pigouvians first, if you will, Coase and Buchanan. And then Baumol uses it first in a review of Buchanan's work, and then Baumol and Oates in a seminal paper where they basically take Keynes, and they say this, we're taking Keynes's work and we're just going to put it in a more formal, let's say Cole style, simplify Cole style model, and they say, and then they're calling it Pigouvian. So that really solidified it. I think this is my last question. Is there another question after this one? After Cleo? Anyone? Speak up if I'm missing one. How common was it in the 1960s and 70s to read economics from the past 30 or 40 years? Right, so are you gonna go back? This is a similar question, I think. Are they going back to Pigou at all? I wonder about the sort of relation to previous literature and the time span of texts that economists read. Seems to have been reduced because of the amount of literature produced and disappearance of HET in mainstream curricula. Yeah, I think that's probably true. You know, the economists in the 60s, you know, the guys who are, you know, in the 1960s, they were trained in the early 50s for the most part. The leaders of environmental economics writing in the 60s were trained in the early 50s. There was another one at Resources for the Future, Marion Clausen, who was trained even earlier. He was near the end of his career. Economists were starting to, you know, it wasn't just young guys who were moving in the 60s. A lot of economists were making a pivot in their career. So let's go back to the early 50s when they were trained. Pigou, I think, would have still been read. Ely, of course, was old when this happened, but the textbook in American agricultural economics would have been his co-authored work called Land Economics that came out in 1940. So I still think there are those connections there. And then so much of it was applied work that intersected with government work and has been well established. It was the American Institutional School that was in the US government. So the work in the late 40s and 1950s on benefit cost analysis of dam projects, that was all being done by basically American institutional economists. So I think the links go that way. Otherwise, I would say you're right, and that's probably why, you know, Pigou is coming through those other authors like Ellis and Fellner for the most part, but he was prominent enough that I think people knew Pigou. I think I have only 30 seconds. Did I see one last question pop up? No? Am I done? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your questions. Those are great questions and the chance to talk with you. I hope I can see you in person before long and maybe we can talk more.
Well, hello everyone. My presentation will focus on the third book of The Wealth of Nations, where Smith gives a brief account of the rise and fall of feudal system and the emergence of commercial society. I'm particularly interested in Smith's presentation of European history as an unnatural phenomenon. He states that Europe did not follow the natural order of development, but rather an inverted order, suggesting that history has not unfolded the way it should have unfolded. So my aim is to make sense of this odd proposition, like many commentators before me had tried to do. But what I will argue is that the manner in which Smith presents history is essential for understanding the role of this third book in Smith's overall system. I'll start by explaining why the proposition that European progress is inverted is odd. It is even sometimes contradictory with the other elements of Smith's thought. I will show that too. And then I'll argue that Smith puts forward this proposition intentionally. And in doing so, I will build on Smith's rhetorical theory, according to which the style of a discourse is determined by the aim of a discourse. So let's start with what Smith defines as the natural progress of opulence. Quote, according to the natural course of things, the greater part of the capital of every growing society is first directed to agriculture, afterwards to manufactures, and last of all to foreign commerce. This order of things is so very natural that in every society that had any territory, it has always, I believe, been in some degree observed. Well, right after this, he notes that, but though this natural order of things must have taken place in some degree in every such society, it has, in all the modern states of Europe, has been entirely inverted. The foreign commerce of some of their cities has introduced all their finer manufactures, and manufactures and commerce together have given birth to the principal improvements of agriculture. Now, from a general point of view, the proposition is startling because what Smith defines as inverted progress is the only highest level of progress ever reached by humanity, and Smith himself is well aware of the fact that the European progress is a historical exception. Well, let's leave this aside. So what are the causes of this inverted order? Quote, the manners and customs which the nature of their original government introduced and which remained after that government was already altered necessarily forced them into this unnatural and retrograde order, unquote. So the manners and customs and the government that he's referring to are the feudal habits and feudal institutions. According to Smith, the feudal system hindered the production of an agricultural surplus, which was necessary for the creation of towns in the natural way. As a result, European towns grew by long-distance trade rather than the local trade with the countryside. This is his argument for the inverted order of Europe. But from the point of view of Smith's own thought, this idea, the inverted order idea, at first sight creates many inconsistencies. A first problem stems from the example he gives for the natural progress of opulence. In his view, the North American colonies grew rapidly in comparison to the very slow progress that took place in Europe, because in the American colonies, most of the capital was invested in agriculture. So while this may be true, stating that this progress is natural is not even true in Smith's own standards. Why? There are at least two reasons for this. First, if the colonies are investing mostly in agriculture, it is because, as Smith says elsewhere, they are discouraged to invest in manufactures or foreign commerce by mercantile regulations like high duties or the acts of navigation. Moreover, Smith thinks that these regulations are a manifest violation of the most sacred rights of mankind. Another reason is, secondly, if the American colonies grew rapidly, for Smith, this owed in part to the modern institutions of justice and property rights that were imported there with the colonists themselves. So if for Smith, the order of progress had been inverted in Europe because of human institutions, this was also the case with the North American colonies, which paradoxically illustrates the natural order in Smith's view. Another inconsistency has been pointed out by Blecker, who shows that Smith's theory of international division of labor clashes with the natural progress of opulence. Because Smith's trade theory entails that production for world market and therefore foreign commerce begins with the early stages of economic development. In other words, a country can acquire its absolute advantage in international trade only if it is creating surplus produce, which is beyond the consumption of the home market. As a result, Smith's trade theory concurs with the European order of progress, which Smith, again, paradoxically calls unnatural. There is yet another problem which is somewhat overlooked. In fact, rather than a problem, it's an observation about the forceful effort Smith makes to justify the naturalness of the progress of opulence. Let me explain. Just before the third book, Smith ends the second book with a chapter entitled "Of the Different Employments of Capitals." Here, he lays out for the first time a similar version of the natural progress of opulence that we just saw. So here he says, first agriculture, next manufacturing, then domestic trade, and last carrying trade. And he argues that this order of investment would yield the maximum of the national produce, the national produce, and national revenue. So in this sense, it's not surprising that many commentators emphasize the continuity between the third book and the second book. But there's an important difference as expressed in this passage by Smith. While in the second book, the order of investment is established from a theoretical point of view with a regard to public interest, in the third book, Smith supposedly explains how capital is invested in practice by real people with a regard to their private interests. So if in Europe, foreign commerce is preferred over agriculture, this is because it is more profitable. But Smith has to make a very strong assumption to establish the priority of agriculture. He states that natural progress of opulence works only, quote, upon equal or nearly equal profits, such that upon equal profits, he argues that people naturally invest in agriculture because it is less risky. So agriculture is much less riskier than manufacturing or, of course, carrying trade. This strong assumption about the equality of profits may have been condoned if Smith had not beforehand in the first book of The Wealth of Nations noted that profit and risk were positively related, as we can see in this below citation. So now we can ask, why is Smith at pains to construct this natural progress of opulence? Well, this must have something to do with the content of his historical account of progress. What does this account explain us? There is not enough time for me to go into the details of this account, which starts off with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but the central idea which underlies the whole history in this chapter can be summarized by this passage where Smith refers to David Hume. Quote, "Commerce and manufactures gradually introduced order and good government, and with them the liberty and security of individuals among the inhabitants of the country who had before lived almost in a continual state of war with their neighbors and of servile dependency upon their superiors. This, though it has been the least observed, is by far the most important of all their effects." Mr. Hume is the only writer who, as far as I know, has hitherto taken notice of it. Now, for Dennis Rasmussen, who wrote the Hume and Smith book, the latest book, he says that this is probably the single most important passage in the Wealth of Nations, because it is Smith's most explicit affirmation about the benefit of commerce in all of his works. So, but how does commerce introduce liberty? In this, Smith and Hume concur. They have a very similar explanation. The crux of this argument is that foreign commerce resulted in the decline of power of the feudal nobility and in the rise of power of towns and merchants. And commerce could produce such an effect by creating a change in consumer tastes and thus in methods of expense. This is what Hume and Smith mainly refer to as manners also. So as feudal lords became acquainted with luxurious products, they gradually started to buy more and more of these goods, rather than maintaining large numbers of retainers and tenants who were the source of their political power. At the same time, merchants and artificers gradually became more and more independent. They made alliance with the king against the feudal lords. While the king thus gained power, the merchants acquired privileges from the king. They had their own government, collected their own taxes, and in return paid a fixed rent to the king. So this is how this order of the feudal times was gradually replaced by security and order, which in turn fostered more economic development. This is Hume's and Smith's account in a nutshell. And as such, as this story stands, this appears to be a praise of commerce. And it's the praise of foreign commerce. For instance, the privileges given by the king to town people has quite a big role in this story. But these are the same privileges which resulted in what Smith calls the mercantile system. And from this point of view, his history can be considered as the history of how mercantile regulations contributed to liberty and wealth. My proposition is that Smith wanted to hide what his historical account implied by his peculiar way of presentation. He needed the natural progress of opulence and insisted on its naturalness so that he could define European history of commerce and of progress unnatural. And comparing Smith to Hume at this point helps us to see how Smith frames his historical account differently. Besides the difference in presentation, there are, of course, many other differences in content. Here I can just say that Hume's history of England contains a real history of the fall of feudalism, which is embedded in a much more detailed account of important event in English history, and it considers the role of clergy, the church, the evolution of monetary relations, of public revenue, of military expenses that Smith is not talking about here. But what Smith wants to accomplish is exactly the opposite of Hume, in the sense that Smith wants to provide a very simple causal account. Let's look at the contents of the third book. After having outlined what the natural progress of opulence is in the first chapter, he starts out with the state of agriculture of countryside after the fall of Roman Empire in the second chapter. And here he starts from the fall of Roman Empire, he arrives all the way to the contemporary Britain. At the second chapter, he goes on with the state of towns, of the merchants and manufacturers. And again, after the fall of Roman Empire, he arrives at contemporary Britain. And third, finally, what he does is to combine these two preceding chapters And he explains how towns influence the country during this large stretch of time. And of course, the simple causal relationship between here is the one between commerce and liberty. So in doing so, Smith follows his own advice on historical writing as he explains to students in his lectures on rhetoric and ballet. When there is a story in different places, he says it's better to relate first the connection of place. Quote, that is, relate those that happened in the same place for some considerable succession of time without interrupting the thread of the narration by introducing those happened in a different place. And he says, resuming afterwards the former by itself where he had left it off. So, and then he adds that besides the connection of place and time, of course, the most important historical relation is the relation between cause and effect. So let me conclude by saying that here I want to argue that Smith uses a style of historical writing and through this style, he seeks to draw our attention away from the content of his European history, which relates the benefits of the mercantile and the origins of the mercantile system. Thank you. So if there are questions, I can take them. And if there are, yeah, I'll wait some.
Can I ask before they appear?
Yes, of course.
So how did Smith justify the fact that agriculture is less risky than manufacture? Is it just due to that, well, agriculture produces the essential goods?
Well, it's more about, like in the passage that I showed, he says that the capital that you invest in agriculture is under your view. It's like he talks that it's more secure in the sense that we can see it, and it's tangible. It's not like we take our capital and invest in this risky ship that will sail to the new world, for instance. This is the logic. So he even, to justify the naturalness of the progress of Opulence, so the priority of agriculture, he also says that this is our natural needs, in the sense that we need subsistence, we need food. So agriculture must be the first. We don't need luxuries first, it's the second need. So that's, yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's just that it was weird to me in the sense that it so much depends on harvest, and it has been used by many other economists saying that, well, we so much depend on harvest that in the Soviet Union as well. So this is more about like the capital that we invest is actually the capital that we control pretty much directly.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. A question from Jimena. Do you think there is any relation between your interpretation of Smith's natural progress of Opulence and the one of the ongoing controversies at the time about the negative, vicious corrupting influence of the city and city mores? And another question, what do you think Smith means precisely by natural? Well, these are very, well, I don't think I'll try to respond to the second question in the sense that it takes so much time. But for the first question, I can say that since I'm comparing Smith with Hume, because he himself refers to him, what I realize is the fact that Smith is much less political in that sense. He doesn't seem to have the same apprehension about the growing moneyed interests in the big cities of London, for instance, that Hume or Bolingbroke or many others of his contemporaries have. I think he's much less pessimistic about big cities, but I'm only saying this in comparison to Hume or the others who were very highly indebted in these, who were engaged in these debates. And so, okay, I have one more minute, so, and not any question, so I'll try to respond to the second question also. Well, natural, I guess, is here, natural progressive opulence, I think he uses it as in a normative sense here. That's how I take it to be, ought to be like this. Okay. Do you have something to say, Spencer, or? Yeah. You're muted.
I don't know if I can sneak it in. There's this fascinating book by Frederick Johnson on nature's frontier, Enlightenment's frontier, about sort of speculative efforts in the 18th century to make Scotland more agriculturally productive. And all these risky, I'll call them risky schemes, all these risky schemes to try new kinds of farming with new plants that were brought from the New World in combination with new sheep breeds and all this kind of thing. And I'm just wondering what he would have thought about that kind of investment, because it's sort of it's obviously agriculture, but it's a very worldwide commercial enterprise of exploration to find new plants that can grow in Scotland and bring them back, and then trying new, again, risky investments.
Yeah, I think he would have a much more technical and more how to say, concrete account of what I know what he writes, and he's working a lot on natural history in the real sense, not in the natural history philosophical sense. So he would have a much more technical account, and I would love to read his book on this with this perspective in mind. Thank you for the reference. Well, I think we arrived at the end of the session, right? So we can thank all the attendees.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, and have a nice day.
Yes, it feels very unceremonial, but I guess we just leave.
Yeah.
And thank you, Amy, for helping us be organized here.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.